The candles in Lady Carew's drawing room had been burning since 7, and by the time Mrs. Clara Wren arrived, the wax had softened to a warm amber that pooled the light unevenly across the assembled guests. She came in quietly, which was consistent with what the room would later say about her, that she was the sort of woman one noticed only after the fact, at the edge of a gathering, present but undemanding of presence, her black morning gown absorbing the light rather than returning it. The veil was the thing that distinguished her. Not a short mourning veil pinned back at the forehead in the fashion of women 18 months past their loss, but a full sweep of dark gauze that fell from the crown of her bonnet to the level of her chin, obscuring the lower portion of her face with the particular opacity that signals fresh grief, or to those who look more carefully. Something that is not grief at all, but its useful disguise. She accepted a cup of tea from the footman without looking up. She moved to the window that overlooked the rear garden, where the last of the autumn roses were going brown against the stone wall, and she stood there, with her back partially turned, holding her cup with both gloved hands in a posture of such studied containment that 2 of Lady Carew's other guests remarked to each other that they felt almost guilty for existing in the same room. Matthew Alderton, Marquess of Carew, stood near the fireplace with a glass he had not touched, watching her. He was not a man who watched women at his aunt's drawing-room gatherings, as a rule. He had perfected over the course of 3 solitary years the particular art of appearing entirely engaged with whoever was speaking to him while retaining almost nothing of what was said. He was good at this. He was good at many things that did not help him sleep. The woman in the full mourning veil had pulled his attention across the room with a precision he could not account for, the way a word does when you have forgotten it, and then hear it spoken in someone else's conversation, and you cannot recall why you know it, only that you do. Her gloves were black kid, the correct weight for the season, and she lifted the teacup with a movement of the wrist that was deliberate and composed, the kind of deliberateness that belongs to a woman who has trained herself not to spill things. The back of her hand, where the glove met the cuff of her sleeve, showed a strip of pale skin, and the line of her jaw beneath the gauze was a shape he kept not looking at directly, because when he looked at it directly, he felt the obscure anxiety of a man who has mislaid something important and cannot remember where he left it. "Lord Carew," said Lady Pemberton at his elbow, and he turned. "You look as though you have seen something troubling." "I am perfectly well," he said. Across the room, Mrs. Clara Wren set down her cup and did not take another. If you find yourself thinking that women such as this one do not simply appear in London drawing-rooms without a history attached to them, you are right. Stay a little longer. What she was hiding is worth the wait. The first thing one understood about Eleanor Vane, in those years before the world decided she was dead, was that she had her father's eyes. Richard George Vane had been a man of considerable learning and moderate fortune, a widower who had remarried late in life and lived to regret it, though not long enough to undo the damage the remarriage produced. His daughter Eleanor had inherited his gray eyes and his particular habit of noticing things that other people's manners trained them not to see, and both of these qualities had served her poorly in the household of her stepmother. And then after her stepmother's death, in the uneasy dominion of her stepbrother Lord Phineas Vane, who inherited the estate and the questions attached to it. The questions were financial in nature. Richard Vane had left a private codicil to his will, witnessed by his own solicitor and sealed, that bequeathed Eleanor £12,000 independent of the estate, to be held in trust and released upon her marriage or her 25th birthday, whichever came first. Phineas had known about this codicil. Phineas had spent 3 years doing everything within his power to ensure that Eleanor never collected it. What he had not anticipated was that Eleanor would survive. The carriage accident on the bridge over the Dene River in December of 1814 had been real, and the flood that had swallowed the carriage had been real, and the body that was never recovered from the water had been real in its absence. What Phineas did not know was that the carriage had been carrying not only Eleanor, but Agnes Corby, her father's former housekeeper who had been traveling with her, and that Agnes had pulled Eleanor from the water in the dark and half carried her 3 miles to the nearest farmhouse. and that the two women had made a quiet accounting of their situation beside a fire that smelled of peat and wet wool, and reached a conclusion that changed the rest of Eleanor's life. She was believed dead. The household had been told. The river had kept its secret. It took Agnes 4 days to comprehend what Eleanor was proposing, and 6 more to agree to it. They had gone north together under the name Wren, which had been Agnes's mother's name, and they had lived in Yorkshire for 3 years on the small amount of money Eleanor had carried in her traveling bag. It was enough, carefully managed, to last 3 years. It was not enough for 4. Eleanor had come to London for the codicil. She had come because the document existed, because she knew approximately where Phineas kept his private papers, and because she had 23 months left before she turned 25, and the trust's machinery would grind forward without her, and the money would route to Phineas by default. She had come as Mrs. Clara Wren, widow of a northern gentleman, friend of Lady Carew's, through a letter of introduction Agnes had procured through a distant connection. She had come with her full mourning veil and her black gloves, and her father's miniature hidden in the lining of her reticule, and she had told herself that she would be in London no longer than a fortnight. She had not counted on Lord Carew looking at her the way he did, the second occasion on which the Marquess of Carew's attention fixed on Mrs. Hedis. Clara Wren arrived 5 days later, in Lady Carew's morning room, where that lady's elderly companion, Mrs. Fitch, spent the early afternoons in a chair near the window, because the light was good for her embroidery and bad for her eyesight, which had been failing for 2 years with a dignified steadiness that seemed to embarrass nobody more than Mrs. Bear. Fitch herself, Eleanor had taken to sitting with her. She was not entirely sure why she had started, perhaps because Mrs. Fitch asked nothing, required only the sound of a voice, and existed in a kind of comfortable solitude that Eleanor recognized and did not pity. She had brought a volume of verse from the library, a collection her father had kept on his desk, whose lines she knew before she opened it. She had sat with Mrs. Merce. Fitch had begun to read aloud, and after the 3rd page she had closed the book without meaning to and recited the rest from memory, her eyes on the garden outside, her hands holding the closed volume in her lap as though it were still open. She did not hear Matthew come to the doorway. He did not announce himself. He stood there for 4 minutes by the clock on the mantel. He counted this afterward, in a faintly disordered way, the way one counts things when the mind is trying to stabilize itself. He watched her recite verse to a woman who could not see her face, her voice steady and low and uncommonly precise in its rhythms, her hand going once to the reticule in her lap with a touch so brief and habitual that it was almost not a touch at all. And the expression that crossed her features in that half-second was not grief and was not sentiment, but was something much older and more particular, a look he had seen before on someone whose name he could not yet retrieve. Stepped back before she finished, and went to stand in the corridor until the recitation ended, because he did not wish to interrupt and because he was not ready to be seen having listened. When the other guests began to circulate before the midday meal, a young baronet named Sir Frederick Howe made his way toward Mrs. Minnis. Clara Wren, with the proprietary interest of a man who has decided to be charming and has not thought the decision through. Matthew crossed the room in 3 strides and came to stand slightly ahead of Mrs. Braid. Wren, before Sir Frederick could reach her. "I believe Lady Carew has asked for you in the east sitting-room, Mrs. Wren," Matthew said, his voice entirely level. He looked at Sir Frederick without particular expression. "She mentioned the music arrangements for Thursday evening." Eleanor looked up at him from beneath the veil's edge. "Of course," she said, after a pause that lasted exactly as long as it needed to. Later, Mrs. Sickty. Arthur Wingate said to Lady Pemberton, in a voice that was quieter than she intended, "I cannot imagine where Meredith finds them. Some widow from nowhere, I am told, here for the library subscriptions, apparently." Lady Pemberton returned a sound that was neither agreement nor refusal. Matthew, who was 3 feet to Mrs. Tobras, Wingate's left and had the hearing God gives to men who have spent 3 years in the countryside with nothing to attend to but ambient sound, did not alter his expression by a degree. Pendas. It was at the Pemberton dinner, a week later, that Eleanor became aware she was being observed with the specific quality of attention that precedes identification. She had been careful. She had varied her speech patterns with deliberate small inconsistencies. She had allowed the mourning veil to do its work, which was considerable. She had told no one anything true about herself except Lady Carew, to whom she had said only that she was a widow, that she was in London briefly, and that she was grateful for the introduction. She had not gone to any event where Phineas was likely to appear. She had not gone near the Vane townhouse. She had done everything correctly. And yet, in the week between the witnessing scene and the Pemberton dinner, she had encountered Lord Carew twice in Lady Carew's library, where she had taken to spending her mornings on the pretense of finding a particular volume that she had already found on the first morning. She was not, she knew, deceiving anyone. With excellent judgment, she was simply not ready to stop going. The first occasion he had been standing at the south window with a letter he had finished reading, his back to the door, and he had heard her enter, and not turned around. She had taken a volume from the nearest shelf, and stood for 15 minutes reading a treatise on the drainage of Fenland that had nothing to recommend it, and the two of them had occupied the same room in silence, that was not comfortable and not uncomfortable, but was instead charged in the way that proximity becomes when it has been noticed and not acknowledged. The second occasion, he had spoken. He had asked her, without turning from the window, whether she played the pianoforte or only recited verse. She had said she played, when occasion demanded. He had said nothing for a moment, and then he had said, "My aunt's gatherings demanded on Thursdays," and turned, and looked at her with those steady eyes in which she could see, now that she was looking carefully, the specific exhausted quality of a man who has been asking himself an unanswerable question for 3 years. She had said she would see what could be arranged, and left, and sat in her room for 20 minutes, with her hands flat on the writing table, not moving. The Marquis of Carew sat across the table from her at the Pemberton dinner, and asked her, during a lull in the general conversation where she had grown up. It was not an unusual question. It was the kind of question one asked at a dinner table when the soup had been removed and the fish had not yet arrived. She had an answer prepared. Shropshire, she said. A small property near Shrewsbury. He nodded and said nothing further, and the conversation moved on. And she could not account for why she felt for the rest of the meal that his silence was not the silence of a man who had accepted an answer, but the silence of a man who had filed it. It was Lady Carew herself who told her about Cecily 3 days later, in the unconscious way that women of a certain age confide the things they carry. "My nephew is not cold," Lady Carew said, without particular context, while they were reviewing the arrangement of flowers in the blue sitting room. "People think he is cold. He has been cold perhaps for 3 years. Cold and wounded are not the same thing, and I find that people of intelligence rarely confuse them for long." She picked up a stem that had dropped a petal and set it aside. He had a younger sister, Cecily. She died in childbed 3 winters ago, and he arranged the marriage, and he has not forgiven himself for it. The guilt sits in him like a stone. You can see it if you know what to look for. Eleanor knew what to look for. She had been looking at guilt sitting in people like a stone for 3 years. She had been the thing that put it there, in the case of certain people who had genuinely mourned her, and the knowledge had not made the deception easier. She thought about Cecily's death and Matthew's stillness at dinner, and the way he had asked his question about Shropshire with the patience of a man who was capable of carrying a long weight. What she did not yet know was that he had already written to a contact in Yorkshire. If you are wondering whether the Marquis of Carew is someone who can keep a secret when given a reason to, or whether he is a man who acts without one, that question is about to be answered. Stay. Eleanor's first attempt to reach the codicil happened on a Tuesday, when Agnes had confirmed through the Vane household's laundress that Lord Phineas was engaged at his club from noon until 4. She had gone to the Vane townhouse on Cavendish Street by way of the tradesman's entrance, where Agnes had arranged with a footman who owed her a favor from a previous life, and she had been admitted to the ground-floor study for 20 minutes. The study was the room she had remembered, and the remembering arrived with a particular force she had not anticipated. Her father had used this room before the estate passed to Phineas, when the family came to London for the season. The shelves held the same leather-spined volumes she had read as a girl, or their successors, arranged with a neatness that was Phineas's and not her father's. The writing table was different, newer, the surface unmarked by the ink rings that her father's had collected over 30 years of correspondence. A portrait of Phineas himself hung where her father's had hung, which she had known would be the case, and which struck her nonetheless with a small, cold accuracy that she absorbed and set aside, because she did not have time for it. The document chest was locked. She had expected this, and she had brought a small tool for the purpose, and the lock defeated her within 3 minutes of sustained effort, at which point she stopped because she had the instinct, sharpened by 3 years of careful living, not to force things when force produced noise. She found, instead, in the writing table's unlocked left drawer, a letter from Mr. Thaddeus Norris of Norris & Bell, solicitors, addressed to Lord Phineas, and dated the previous week. She read it standing up, her gloves still on her hands, not quite steady. The letter described a petition to the ecclesiastical court for a formal declaration of death in the matter of the late Miss Vane, deceased. It cited the 3-year interval since the accident, the lack of a body, the corroborated witness testimony of the carriage driver who had survived. It anticipated, in Norris's careful prose, a favorable disposition within the month. Within the month, Eleanor ceased to exist by law, and the £12,000 routed to the estate by default, and Phineas collected the settlement he had tried to arrange by other means 3 winters ago. She folded the letter back precisely along its original creases and returned it to the drawer. She left the house through the same door she had entered. On the street, the autumn air had gone cold and smelled of coal smoke and the river, and she walked 2 blocks before she felt her hands stop trembling. At Phineas's dinner that same evening, which Agnes had booked through the drawing-room invitation, Eleanor had foolishly accepted before reading the letter, a matron named Mrs. Harriet Foyle turned to her across the table and said, with the particular kindness that functions as its opposite, "You must forgive me, Mrs. Wren, but I cannot place you at all. You are the widow from nowhere, as they have taken to calling you. It is quite the mystery. We all adore a mystery, of course, until we have solved it." Eleanor said she was from Shropshire, and smiled behind her veil and meant nothing. It was at Lady Carew's music evening, 2 days after the dinner, that the miniature fell. The pianoforte had been arranged near the east window, and the guests had settled into their listening postures, the particular stillness of polished people performing the appreciation of music, and Eleanor had taken the chair nearest the instrument at Lady Carew's insistence, since Lady Carew knew she played and had half-asked. Half-commanded that she might take a turn later in the evening, Eleanor had set her reticule on the edge of the piano bench beside her. She had not noticed it shifting as the third performer, a Miss Ashby, played with the sustained vigor of someone who believed the fortissimo marking was a suggestion, rather than an instruction. The reticule dropped from the bench. She heard it and looked down, and saw the miniature on the floor 2 feet away, the enamel face upward, her father's painted features small and clear in the candlelight, having slipped through the gap in the lining that she had been meaning to mend for 6 weeks. Matthew, who was standing 3 feet to her left, moved before she did. He crouched and retrieved it from the floor, in a single fluid motion that was quiet enough not to interrupt Miss Ashby's fortissimo passage. He held it for a moment, and she watched his thumb turn it over to the reverse, where her father's initials, R.G.V., were inscribed in the small brown script that had belonged to Richard George Vane for 62 years. Matthew looked at the initials. He looked at her. Eleanor held out her hand, palm up, very still, and said nothing. He placed the miniature in her gloved palm without a word. His fingers did not linger. Before he straightened, he looked at her face, or at the portion of it visible beneath the veil's lower edge, and whatever he found there, rearranged something in his expression that had been arranged tightly for a long time, The way a garment shifts when a seam that was pulled too close is finally given room. He returned to his position. Miss Ashby finished her fortissimo passage. The room applauded. Agnes told her the following morning, over the tea they took together in the small sitting room of their hired rooms, that she had heard from the footman who owed her a favor, who had heard from the kitchen maid who collected linen from the Vane household. That Lord Phineas had been heard using the phrase, the widow from nowhere, in reference to Lady Carew's new acquaintance. Phineas had been speaking to his fiancée, Miss Louisa Fitch, no relation to the companion, and he had said it with the particular lightness of a man who is not quite as easy as he sounds. Eleanor heard this, and understood that she had less time than she had calculated. Lord Carew came to the hired rooms that evening, which was itself a transgression of propriety, significant enough that Agnes, who answered the door, looked at Eleanor with an expression that contained several questions she was too intelligent to ask aloud. Eleanor received him in the small sitting room, Agnes stationed in the adjoining room with the door not quite closed, which was as much chaperonage as the situation was going to produce. He sat down across from her. He had not removed his gloves, which meant he was not planning to stay long, or that he had not decided yet. Mrs. Haas Wren, he said, and then stopped and looked at her in a way that suggested the next sentence was not going to contain the name he had just used. She took off the veil. She set it on the arm of the chair beside her. She let him look at her face. The silence was the length of a measured breath. "You attended my memorial," she said. "I did," he said. His voice was level, but his hand, still gloved, had closed on his knees. December of 1814, the church on Gilmore Street. The family was all Phineas and his mother's people. The notice said you were 21 years old. I was 21 years old. The codicil, he said. Not a question. My father's solicitor drew it. Phineas has the document. He has a month's petition before the ecclesiastical court declares me legally dead, at which point the £12,000 he has been holding for 3 years roots to him by default, and any future claim I might make is foreclosed. She watched him take this in. I came for the document. I was unable to reach it. He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a cart went past in the street, and the window glass rattled faintly in its frame. Norris, he said at last. Lord Phineas's solicitor. Yes, he witnessed my father's original will filing, which means he has knowledge of the codicil's existence in his own records. Phineas has been paying for his discretion for 3 years. I know Norris, Matthew said. She had not expected him to say that. She had not, if she was precise about it, expected any of this to go as it had gone. She had expected discovery, eventually, as a risk to be managed. She had not expected to feel sitting across from a man who attended her memorial anything except the cold animal urgency of survival. What she felt was something she did not have a name for in that sitting room. She catalogued it carefully and set it aside. I am asking you only to say nothing, she said. 3 more days I will find another way to reach the document. He looked at her for a moment, and then he said, All right, and stood, and took his leave. And Agnes in the adjoining room released a breath that was audible through the not quite closed door. 3 days proved to be a luxury Eleanor did not have. The following morning she went to the Vane townhouse and was admitted to the front hall by a butler, who had clearly received new instructions, because he took her card with the politeness of a man who has been told to be polite while something else is arranged. She waited 15 minutes in the morning room before Phineas appeared. He had her father's eyes, which she had always hated, and his mother's chin, which was built for confidence, and he looked at her the way a man looks at a problem he had thought was solved when it presents itself at his morning room door. Eleanor, he said pleasantly. I would like my father's codicil, she said. He sat down without being invited to, in the chair that faced the window, so the light was behind him, and in her face. You have been in London for 3 weeks, he said. You have been attending Lady Carew's gatherings under a false name and representing yourself as a widow of a northern gentleman. That is impersonation, Eleanor. That is a criminal matter, independent of whatever you believe about the codicil. The codicil is a legal document establishing my inheritance. The codicil is a document in my possession that pertains to the estate of a woman who drowned in the Den River in December of 1814, and whose death has been registered in this county and will be confirmed by the ecclesiastical court within the month. He looked at her with something that was not quite cruelty. It was the look of a man who has arranged things carefully and is confirming that the arrangement holds. I would suggest that Mrs. Motley, Clara Wren, returned to Yorkshire or wherever she has been keeping herself before her resemblance to a dead woman becomes a subject of official inquiry. She looked at him for a long time. She noted that the codicil was not in the room, which meant it was upstairs in the locked chest, which meant she could not take it. She noted that Phineas had not called for the butler, which told her something about his preferred management of the situation. He wanted her gone, not apprehended, because apprehending her would require explaining her existence to people who currently believed her dead. And Phineas found complexity inconvenient. "We were not close as children," she said, which was true and entirely beside the point, and which she said because she found she wished to say something that was not a capitulation, even if it was not a victory. "No," he said. He sounded for a moment almost rueful. Then the moment passed. "Return to Yorkshire, Eleanor. There is nothing here for you." She looked at her father's study. She looked at the writing table that was not her father's, and the portrait that was not her father's, and the shelves of books that had been selected by a man who had arranged her death and lived comfortably inside the space it made. She left. The morning of the ecclesiastical court hearing arrived with the particular gray light of a London November, clouds flattening the city into silhouette, the street below the hired room's window wet from rain that had stopped an hour before dawn. Eleanor had not slept. She sat at the writing table in her night things, and her father's miniature in her palm, and thought, with the methodical calm of a woman who has been making careful accountings for 3 years, about what she had and what she did not have. She did not have the codicil. She did have a statement in her own hand, witnessed by Agnes attesting to her identity. She did have the miniature with her father's initials inscribed in his own handwriting. She did have 3 years of letters that Agnes had written to a cousin in the north, which were dated and referred to Eleanor by her true name, though this was inadmissible under normal circumstances. She did not have a solicitor. She did not have a friendly face in the court. She thought about Matthew. She allowed herself this with a precision she had not permitted before, turning over the specific facts of him the way her thumb turned over the miniature in her palm. The way he had stood in the doorway of Lady Carew's morning room and not announced himself. The way he had retrieved the miniature from the floor without a word and placed it in her hand without lingering. The way he had sat across from her in the hired rooms and listened, fully, the way people who have learned to live with grief learn to listen, without the habit of interruption that belongs to those who have not yet understood that silence is where truth lives. He had said all right and meant it. She had believed him, and she was not, by 3 years' careful practice, a woman who believed easily. She had not counted on wanting to be believed. She had not, if she was being exact, counted on wanting. She was still at the writing table when Agnes came in, dressed for the street, with an expression that meant she had news. "The Marquess of Carew's man called at 6 this morning," Agnes said. "His lordship asked that you do not go to the court before 9. He asked that you be at the court at 9. He asked that you bring the miniature." She looked at Agnes for a moment. "He asks," Agnes repeated, with the particular dryness of a woman who has managed another woman's survival for 3 years, and has opinions about men who issue instructions without explaining them. Eleanor was at the court at 9 with the miniature and her black veil. She wore the veil. Matthew was already in the anteroom with Mr. Thaddeus Norris at his side, and Norris looked like a man who had spent the night reconsidering his professional choices from a significant height. Lord Pemberton, a senior peer and a man of considerable weight in matters of ecclesiastical law, stood near the window with his hands clasped behind his back, and the expression of a man who has been asked a significant favor and has agreed to grant it and would like the matter concluded efficiently. Phineas was already in the court chamber. He did not see Eleanor until the proceeding opened, because she sat behind the bar and kept the veil in place, and his attention was on the magistrate who was reading from the petition. Matthew had told her in the 5 minutes they had in the anteroom what Norris had produced, the original will filing signed and dated in Norris's own office records, which referenced the private codicil by name and amount. Norris, his own professional copy, kept as was his obligation under the Law Society's protocols, which had existed in his files for 6 years and which he had not destroyed because, as he had explained to Matthew the previous night in terms that suggested the explanation had cost him something, the law required he retain it, and he had retained it, though he had not volunteered its existence to anyone who had not asked. Matthew had asked. He had asked at 11 at night with the patience of a man who understood what leverage was made of and preferred to apply it quietly. Norris, to his credit, had required very little persuasion. He had required only the opportunity to do the thing he had been trained to do, which was honor the law, and a senior peer willing to stand witness to his doing it. Eleanor had listened to this in the anteroom with her hands folded in her lap and her veil still down, and she had felt beneath the cold, practical machinery of the morning something that she could not afford to feel yet, but which was present nonetheless, warm and specific in the region of her chest. The magistrate called for any objections to the petition. Matthew stood. He presented Norris. He presented Pemberton. He presented the documents. Phineas turned in his seat, and his eyes found the woman behind the bar, and he stilled the way a man stills when he has run a careful calculation and arrived at a result that is not what the calculation was supposed to produce. Eleanor watched his face for the half-second in which he understood what was happening, and she saw something in it that was not guilt, but was adjacent to it, the expression of a man who had told himself a story for 3 years about what his choices had cost and was now confronting the fact that the cost had been paid by someone who was still here. "Present the invoice." She rose from the bench. She reached up. She lifted the veil from her face and held it in her hand, and let the courtroom see her. The silence was total, the kind that happens when a room recognizes something it was not prepared to recognize, and holds its breath against the weight of it. "Eleanor Vane is alive," Matthew said, his voice carrying without effort across the small chamber, "and she is mine to protect." Phineas began to say something. Pemberton looked at him with the unhurried authority of a man who has not needed to raise his voice in 30 years, and Phineas stopped. The magistrate called a pause. The proceeding lasted another 40 minutes, during which Norris confirmed the codicil's existence. Eleanor provided her sworn statement, and the miniature was examined and the initials confirmed against a sample of her father's handwriting that Norris produced from the same files. Phineas's counsel attempted 2 objections that did not hold. Pemberton signed the document that confirmed Eleanor's legal identity and formal existence. The petition for her death was dismissed. Phineas left without speaking to her. His fiancée, who had been sitting in the gallery, left with him, and the expression on her face was that of a woman doing a quiet recalculation that had been building for some time and had simply required a sufficient occasion to complete itself. Eleanor stood in the anteroom afterward, with the miniature in her hand and the veil folded over her arm, and the morning light coming through the high window in a single gray shaft, and she felt, for the first time in 3 years, that the air was at its ordinary pressure. Agnes, who had waited in the street, came in through the court's side door and looked at Eleanor's face and said nothing, but pressed Eleanor's free hand briefly between both of hers in the gesture of a woman who has kept another woman alive and is quietly glad the effort has been justified. The codicil was released to her within a week, by Norris under instruction, the £12,000 confirmed, and the trust's clock running forward as her father had intended. Lady Carew, when told the full account, produced an expression of such controlled satisfaction that it rendered unnecessary any other comment on the subject of Phineas's character and ambitions. 3 weeks later, in Lady Carew's drawing room on a Tuesday morning, with the November fire burning low and the first real cold of winter pressing at the windows, Eleanor sat across from Matthew and held a cup of tea she had not drunk, and felt the particular strangeness of having her own name again, which was something she had not understood she missed, until someone else had spoken it in a room full of witnesses and made it hold. "Cecily!" she said at some point in the conversation, and he was quiet for a moment, and then he said yes, that had been her name, and Eleanor said, "You arranged the marriage because you believed it was sound, and you were deceived about the household, and you have been carrying that for 3 years as though the fault were yours to carry." She said it plainly, without adornment, because she had learned in 3 years of careful living that plain things said plainly had more weight than elegant ones. He was still for a long time. "You are not wrong," he said at last. His voice was very low. "I am not wrong," she said. "I am also someone who spent 3 years being erased by a man who was confident of the outcome. It has taught me to be precise about fault. The fire settled." He looked at her across the small distance between their chairs, and the look had in it something that was not the controlled surveillance of a man trying to solve something, but the quieter thing that comes after a solution, and does not yet know what to do with itself. From his coat pocket he drew Cecily's wedding ring, which he had carried for 3 years, and he set it on the table between them with the deliberateness of a man laying something down that he has been carrying too long. He did not explain the gesture. He did not need to. She thought about want, about 3 years of not permitting herself to want anything that could be taken, and about the £12,000 sitting in trust, and the codicil confirmed, and the name restored, and she thought about the specific quality of his attention, which was not the attention of a man who circled in order to observe, but the attention of a man who circled because he was not yet certain he was wanted, and she thought it was time to make it clear. She reached across the small table and placed her hand over his, gloved hand over ungloved. She did not say anything. He looked at her hand and then at her face, and something in him eased the way a room eases when a window is finally opened, all at once and quietly. On the mantel, the black mourning veil hung over the enamel miniature, not as a burial cloth, but as a thing that had served its purpose and could now be still. Her father's painted features were visible at the veil's edge, his gray eyes that had come down to her, intact and whole through everything that had tried to undo it. She looked at the miniature and at the veil and at Matthew's hand beneath hers, and she drew a breath that had no performance in it, no calculation, no cost. She was herself again. She was present and accounted for, and here,